Our age is one of social instability and political extremism that poses serious risk to the future of humanity and the ecosystems of our planet. The United States is at the heart and center of this crisis.
Let us remember that we can do these things not just because of wealth or power, but because of who we are.
Iraq at the end of this year.
By Pakistani experts revealed that the US has been using chemical munitions.
Its ruthless militarism and numerous occupations are breeding hate, all the while its domestic economy and infrastructure are crumbling, while its prisons and surveillance institutions are growing out of control.
Camp in Cairo's Tahrir Square.
This is just one of the many empty homes. It's been
a growing workforce, but a stagnant economy.
The youth, migrants, workers, indigenous peoples, oppressed peoples, and exploited classes were rising as the collective knowledge of injustice and growing disparity gave way to mass action.
The entire world is fed up with the huge disparity of wealth caused by the present system.
In 2011, it seemed as if the peoples contained in the United States had woken up.
More than 1,000 prisoners started the hunger strike at Pelican Bay's security housing unit known as the SHU.
I charge Pelican Bay with the following crimes: police brutality, racism, promoting inmate-on-inmate violence.
Growing protests against Georgia's racist HB 87, Latinos and Latinas, and other immigrants who face the frightening prospect of being demanded to produce papers, a scenario that is evocative of the Nazis.
The Wisconsin governor proposed to take away collective bargaining rights of trade unionists in Wisconsin who are in the public employ.
Canada's oil sands industry in Alberta is locking horns with environmentalists and Indigenous people.
As Indigenous people, all we're trying to protect is land and the water that is very sacred to us and has been very much a part of our being able to carry out a subsistence lifestyle. And we want to see that for generations to come.
When we identify vacant government homes or foreclosed homes, we open them and we move homeless people into peopleless homes. We think it's immoral to have vacant homes on one side of the street and people living on the street in the other.
Once upon a time, Europeans arrived upon the shores of the continent with a mission they believed to be ordained by God. Their weapons of mass destruction were war, famine, and disease. In pursuit of fortune and conquest, indigenous and African people were enslaved and murdered. Those who survived the so-called discovery of the Americas were made to work and build the wealth of a nation. To build this wealth required the wholesale theft of land and the transformation of captive and enslaved peoples into a subjected labor force, which required deep and extensive oppression. But there was always resistance. The resistance produced liberating ideologies and practices. It was within these beliefs and practices that the oppressed peoples and exploited classes asserted their rights and articulated their humanity. On this very same battleground, there was another movement, a movement of elites who felt abused and dispossessed of their privileges by the British monarch. Their revolt resulted in the creation of a new European nation on American soil that produced a new society which affirmed individual rights to land, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, resulting initially in the securing of civil and political rights for all white male landowners.
In most people's minds, like you said, human rights are something that are elsewhere. In all point of fact, human rights apply everywhere.
It's very important to not think of human rights as just something that happens in the United Nations and by law, but something that is articulated and defined and shaped by the social movements.
Human rights paradigm has a tendency to be an elitist, an exclusionary paradigm, even though the basis of it has to do with the sufferers.
The early drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights looked primarily to Western texts on philosophical and political principles to justify their reasoning. They borrowed heavily from the U.S. Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. These texts are very much rooted in the notions of rights and liberties deriving from Roman law and tradition. However, there are numerous non-European sources that affirm and define the rights of humanity, many of them much older than Western civilization itself, such as Hammurabi's Codex from ancient Babylon, or the Constitution of the Iroquois Confederacy, which was copied extensively by the crafters of the U.S. Constitution. Many religious texts, such as the Bible and the Quran, articulated not only duties, but rights.
Because of the very class nature, the privileged class nature of the human rights framework and the organizations that, do their work through that lens, many times it is not demystified, it is not accessible to the people who need it the most.
Anybody who was advocating for economic justice in particular was somehow a communist. And so we were pushed to deny all of those rights, and that's a legacy which still lingers to this day.
People of color, especially African Americans, were considered 3/5 of a human. That's in the Constitution.
It's written in 300 years of old boy language.
It says all men, and we always add women, are created equal, but we know that that is not so.
One of the two kind of major covenants of the United Nations, there's civil and political rights, and then there's economic, social, and cultural rights.
Civil rights basically deals with a body of laws that were codified by this government. Laws that say you have a right to go to the same restrooms and the same facilities, the same public accommodations as any white person. Human rights address rights that we were born with simply because we're human.
ESCRs, those rights that are, like I said, categorically denied by the United States given its kind of institutional framework. And in base, they are the right to health, the right to health care, the right to education, the right to work. And those are some of, I would say, kind of your base level. And the right to culture being part of education, the right to water. These are some of the basic elements that the international standards say that are a need for people to be fully human.
When social justice activists in the U.S. embrace a human rights framework and use international human rights mechanisms to demand the rights that are ours by virtue of our birth, it matters less whether or not the U.S. government recognizes them.
It's hard for people to understand that they have human rights, but they're not like other rights.
There's been such a long history, I would say really the Truman administration, of denying the applicability of human rights.
What goes along with American exceptionalism is a notion of white supremacy, that this is a white Anglo-Saxon nation and that the hordes are coming from all over the world because we are the best country in the world. I come from a community, the African American community, that suffered through Jim Crow, segregation, through racism, and we called upon people around this country to fight with us for human rights. We say to you, we will stand with you today, tomorrow, until human rights are realized.
We do get immune to seeing what is going on in other countries because we think that we're safer when we're not. I think that is, on one hand, a difficulty to overcome for our people here. But I think other people in other countries probably understand it much more clearly.
We can't expect to gain any respect or any credibility in the world and in the movements throughout the world if we are constantly making apologies and excuses for our own government. And that is the hallmark of exceptionalism that the United States is accepted out of the kind of scrutiny that other countries fall under.
We need to link all these battles. We need to link all these movements and understand that we're all one and that they affect all of us. That the same thing that like people are fighting against all this corporate greed affect us as immigrants. That the violation of civil rights of immigrants affect everybody, right? So that's what we need to understand. We cannot just specialize in one thing and think that that's the one cause that we need to fight or the one movement that we need to fight, but we need to fight every single movement as one.
Most of our social justice work, I think, that takes place in this country is an expression of trying to realize these different rights.
And I think that we are living in a time that if we don't have someone talking about the reason for economic policy being the fulfillment of human rights, then we need to stop talking. One aspect of it is to push for laws to be changed, but the other is to create the kind of environment where laws have to respond to what social movements want.
The struggle is for human rights. And as far as I'm concerned, there is no one way to go about doing that. There's many ways of putting ourselves in a position where we're able to determine our own destiny.
The engagement of grassroots communities, struggling communities, indigenous peoples, and tribal nations through human rights education and training is a very key piece of our strategy, and that is the only way to hold governments accountable.
Because the only time working people get any kind of concessions in this country is when they organize and mobilize in their own name.
When the immigrant rights movement mobilized with the Great American Boycott, 90% of the ports were closed down because the immigrant truckers did not go to work. Later in 2008, 29 ports were closed down on the West Coast to oppose the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I am happy to tell you that we have been a part of a movement, the Million Worker March movement, which has called for the reclaiming of May Day, and it has been reclaimed.
The reason why I and other workers will be standing in solidarity on Wednesday for the call for the general strike by the Occupy Oakland movement is because this is a movement about fighting corporate rule with worker power.
Longshore workers are attempting to shut down the ports in the Bay Area. Longshore workers are attempting to shut down the ports in the Bay Area. Other workers to join us, and hopefully the whole West Coast can be shut down.
But there has to be a certain kind of a political outcome for our struggle. And that means that we have to hit them where it hurts, in the pocketbook.
We're a human rights organization working on behalf of workers and non-workers and their social, economic, and cultural rights.
On May 1st of last year, we held the biggest weekday rally in the history of the state, where over 1,000 Vermonters came out to the State House, flooded the State House with supporters.
And we need a rational way to finance health care. Each of these insurance companies has a different rules, reimbursement, and regulations. And with all of this, we spend an enormous amount of money on administration.
Our problem is that we're spending money for profits, for bureaucracy, for advertising, for billing. We're not spending it where we need it for doctors, nurses, medicine, healthcare professionals. We've got to change our healthcare priorities.
We just saw this in our Healthcare as a Human Right campaign. In fact, the only way that we were able to achieve universal health care in Vermont, which was a real human rights breakthrough, was the employment of a human rights framework that everyone could identify with and that had 5 very simple human rights principles. Those were the principles that the people of Vermont were able to rally around and form a movement that actually tipped the balance of power and achieved something that we were told was not politically possible, which was the passage of Act 48 a universal and unified healthcare system.
Healthcare is a human right by Vermont law.
A gross violation of human rights in many areas that about disempowering our communities that we are not cognizant of. We're not taking it to the international level and exposing the U.S. in those forums. The struggle for communities of color and poor communities around environmental justice issues, which is fighting environmental racism. One of the frameworks was to redefine what environmental justice is, because generally the ecologist and the type of framework internationally in terms of human rights and the protection of natural patrimony was sort of like positioned around like Greenpeace and very top-down organizations. And so we started by redefining environmental justice as, where that is the place where we live, where we work, where we study, where we pray, and where we play.
They use human rights, they use them as a tool. There are human rights law is a tool rather than an end of itself. I think there are greater goals that communities set for themselves, and we see the human rights realization as part of where we get to a more just society, a more social justice movement that is based on equality, justice, and freedom. And that concept is something that we strongly believe in. We think that this is something that has been endorsed by peoples around the world. In fact, human rights law is only manifestation or a translation of people's movements, and increasingly in the last decade or two, and maybe the Declaration on the Rights of People, Indigenous People.
Article 37, affirming that, quote, Indigenous peoples have the right to the recognition, observance, and enforcement of treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements concluded with states or their successors, and to have states honor and respect such treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements, end quote. Further, the preamble of the Declaration emphasizes, quote, the contribution of demilitarization of the lands and territories of Indigenous peoples to peace, economic and social progress and development, understanding and friendly relations among nations and peoples of the world.
Our organization was actually founded in 1974 on the Standing Rock Reservation in South Dakota as a result of several years of uprising of Indigenous peoples, American Indians, Canadian Indigenous peoples, and beginning to spread throughout the hemisphere.
We know your struggle and what you're going through. Our villages were also burned. Our leaders were also killed. Our women were also raped. It's our responsibility to share this sad history with you, to tell you you are not alone in the world. We understand as Indigenous peoples of the world what you're struggling, but more important than that, it's important that you know, it's essential that you know that you have our solidarity and our support in your struggle.
Laid claim to our territories. We focused very soon that the human rights standards that existed, although very important and very valuable, recognizing the inherent rights, very important, that human rights are inherent and inalienable. Nobody gives or takes those. No law, no constitution, no declaration or convention, etc. Rights can be upheld or rights can be violated. They can't be given and taken. You know, those principles reflect very much the understanding of Indigenous peoples and our own cultural concept. But we also realize that the human rights of Indigenous peoples were realized as peoples, as collective rights, and most of the human rights recognized by the international arena, by the United Nations, were individual rights. And so we began to work on our own declaration for the rights of Indigenous peoples, as Jamil noted, and it took us 30 years at the United Nations because this was actually the first international standard developed with the full participation of the subjects of the right. And we actually had walkouts at the United Nations to bring this about. We had hunger strikes. We had demonstrations. We took a people's movement to the halls of Geneva and were able to actually achieve a new level of human rights, which is collective human rights developed as a standard with the full participation of the subjects of the right.
One of the fundamental principles of the Declaration of Human Rights is that the immigrants have the right to live. You know, Latinos and Mexicanos come to the United States that are displaced primarily, in my opinion, by U.S. Intervention policies, you know, economic, political, and military, right? The immigrants have the right to live in a place that no country can make laws excluding folks, you know, calling them so-called illegal. Nobody's illegal. So everyone has a fundamental human right to migrate, to seek a better life, a livelihood for themselves and their family, which includes work, housing, education, and health.
Not only am I an immigrant rights activist, I'm an anti-war activist, right? And I say that the U.S. wars of aggression throughout the world caused mass migration. So I am in solidarity with the people struggling for democracy in Mexico. I'm in solidarity with the Palestinian people. I'm solidarity with the Colombian people, the people in the Philippines, people in Africa, all people.
You know, we work in the Hawaiian Studies and Hawaiian Language Department. How we perceive that work is really learning about Hawaiian Studies and Hawaiian history and Hawaiian language is in itself challenging the status quo, putting at this new generation of children, not just Hawaiian children, children of Hawaii. It's a public school and anybody can attend this school, but we really are looking at trying to educate a new generation of our people. And it's not, language is the vehicle, you know, through Hawaiian language, but really educating them to know their history and their stories and their traditions, and to sort of help them to develop these Hawaiian identities so that we can continue to endure in Hawaii in a different way, in a way that for at least 2 or 3 generations has been, you know, our generation, our parents and our grandparents have been generations of basically assimilation and oppression, and we want this next generation to sort of break those chains off their brains so that they can, they can create a new space.
And my involvement is through the International Indian Treaty Council. And I'm a spiritual advisor for over 2,000 Native American inmates that are incarcerated in state prisons and federal penitentiaries. And I'm also the spiritual advisor for Leonard Peltier, one of the most well-known political prisoner in the United States. And I work with inmates on freedom of worship issues, advocating for their participation in the cleansing and purification ceremony, pipe ceremonies, talking circle. These ceremonies are very important for our people's spiritual wellness.
It's very hard for a formerly incarcerated person to get a job. It's very hard for a formerly incarcerated person to get housing. It's very hard for a formerly incarcerated to get social services going.
We're doing this because we think it's not fair for people to be in prison for their whole lives for a crime that they committed when they were 15 years old, you know? And so I think a lot of people's work here in Los Angeles have been around trying to fight the system for what it's doing to them.
As human beings, we have the sole God-given right to be able to determine our own destiny. We speak in our own voice. We demand that things change from human contact, sexual orientation, gender, class.
My constituency, and I would say I have 2 constituencies. One, immigrants that are in this country, and 2, African Americans, because our work is to try to bring those groups together. And what those constituencies both bring to the table is a history of violations of human and civil rights. Whole communities have been discriminated against, have been racially profiled, have been oppressed for decades, for centuries. And so that experience of oppression helps inform what this document is all about.
And that our problem is
not an American problem, it's a human problem. It's not a Negro problem, it's a problem of humanity. It's not a problem of civil rights, but a problem of human rights.
I think what we need in this country is a real ground-up movement, and the human rights frame offers that, so it educates folks on the ground of what their actual human rights are. And most of my work involves the human right to housing, and we believe that everybody in this country has a human right to housing, but we have to make our voices heard.
I had a home right here that I lived in for years.
The objective of Take Back the Land is to elevate housing as a human right. We believe that housing is a human right, and we believe that the only way to achieve that is to have community control over land.
The social force of revolution in the masses, you know, they must be organized. They must have the organizations that enable them to fight, that enable them to exercise their power to challenge the system with some political consciousness.
The International Worker Justice Campaign, and we've been focusing on using the human rights framework to address the issue of collective bargaining rights and worker rights.
And so for social movements, the only way to get things done is to participate. So for people to get things done, the state is not a resource, right? The only resource is to get involved with other folks, your neighbor, the teacher, this person, that person, and get involved in making social movements happen in order to make even basic common life decisions, whether it be about water, land, fishing, right? Whether it be about domestic violence, right? In Puerto Rico, there's a lot of domestic violence, and that becomes a human rights issue to life, right? To be able to live with your partner safely, and that's not something that the state is going to intervene, because the courts are many times used in just incarcerating folks and not solving the problem, right? So people have to get together and come up with what are solutions, and that's all at the fundamentals, self-determination, right? For a people and for a country, right? But that same thread goes through it, right? This, people try to activate themselves in order to determine their lives, the same way a country can try to come together and make decisions for itself against an imperialist country.
If the government doesn't want the water company to leave the country, the people will throw them out.
Bechtel was the one that stayed. It was a consortium actually, and they decided to take over the water system. If we have a president like Evo Morales, it's because the social movements in April 2000 opened a door for that to happen. And the message, I think, is that the water war is not over. The conflict 10 years ago was not just about water, it was about something else, especially what we call democracy.
What we have learned is that to get this legislation and laws approved is just the first step, because we still have to make sure that this doesn't stay in the paper, and the only way that we have found out that it's possible to make these things apply, it's through mobilization of the people.
There are people who call for a straight-out revolution, and there's a lot to be said for that. There are people who say that we have to change the laws and work with Congress and that type of thing, and there are a lot of people out there working for that. My thing is to bring about change by any means necessary.
Movements have evolved, so will human rights will always continue to evolve. So I don't think if we have this idea somehow human rights is going to always be there, there's some kind of end point. So I think that's a wrong way in interpreting human rights. I think you have to see it as something that will always be evolving.
If you believe in equity and justice, are striving to emancipate humanity from the oppressive grip of white supremacy, capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, and heterosexism, and believe in the rights of Mother Earth and the obligation of humanity to live in balance with all its relations, then the U.S. Human Rights Network is a place for you. Join us in our efforts to transform these United States to make a better world possible.